Nyepa kunle namdol shing yunten kunge genpa bo simje kunge nyen chikpo tamche kenla gun chanse women chege nge podan ne jusum sange kunge ngowo ni rasim chogo ngasumadan zebe zawe lame shabla so wande tambiche nyamsulembe kulung sambo korwale thartwe samba nijungdang rashi simjen tamje ki chiduin sambe ki jaju ki semdang tini detabu tambiche dang chebi ki ngokap jungbati ani sunam chimbuchi yin keba sambuchi yin sambeki ni gato tang tembe koni dambichu sembashu
Please listen to the teachings with a motivation that considers one's wish to practice the sacred Dharma, and that is based on the wish to attain liberation from samsara, renunciation, as well as bodhicitta, the thought that oneself and all sentient beings may attain perfect and complete awakening, and we do practice for the sake of all those sentient beings. In that way, we can also consider how fortunate we are and how precious the opportunity that we have is, since we have met with the sacred Dharma. And so with all of this in mind, please listen to the Dharma teachings.
tini danganzu chidang simgirashin wasawasati kandisiresini dela yakbuji rangyula tobichetu Gyud Lama di da lobchong chambe kabre yine yang da anzu shung di tweba je shaba tsamji gi semla gyuwa tege yo mare dendre ki tweba je shaba ki shung di uni lam gi rimba chi la tenni nyamsu lengu go re de indu dini kasu babe Gyud Lama di chakya chimbo ki shung cha de du ani chachin molam dang tebe kone lam gi rimbe kolla dordu chi da kasang shubi kabre ta dela dunse nga yobe nang ni kasang tangbo lam gi ten dang lam toje ki shirap se di shuisini tanda kasu baba sumba lam gi ngo tini shilam desum di kolchuk meba kandich sambo tangko kare nyamsu lengko kare esini de shubi kabre
If you want to know what this nature of the mind that we describe as luminous, is, then we have to find this out through and actually gain our own experience of this through our real renunciation in our mind. And for that, we are currently studying the Buddha nature, or the Uttara Tantra Shastra. Now, it's not enough to just study this text in order to cause change in our mind, to actually transform our mind. But on the basis of our studies, on the basis of listening, we then need to also put the path into practice according to the different stages. So the Uttara Tantra is actually a text that is explained in the context of Mahamudra, and so we are here now looking at a short or condensed teaching on that, looking at the important points and the basis for the practice accordingly. The aspiration prayers of Mahamudra that we are studying here has 5 parts, out of which we have already completed the support for the path and wisdom, and currently we have reached the 3rd part, which is the basis, the view that describes the ground, path and fruition.
Di 가상아주 사변낭니 딱지 타들 데니 시 도그 타들 손이 남조기 시시 타들 데니 제도비 고죽 메베 셔단 테버 쇼세디다 자와디 디낭니 템바레.
In our root text, in our text in the Mahamudra Aspiration prayers, this is addressed in the verse, "The ground is the true truth, free from eternalist and nihilistic extremes. The supreme path, twofold accumulation, unlimited by projection and denial, brings the fruition twofold benefit, free from the extremes of existence and quintessence. May I encounter this Dharma that is without error or confusion."
Nake number manchela zawaki pechati andi yabosi andi ma lo ani dila malam gyap ani de chik re la tunda kare tu sinin de zawa chik dila yabo chini dona na sini bigul shuguyes.
Most of you have this text, you have the root verses of the Mahamudra Aspiration prayer, and so please read the verses carefully and make according aspirations. And while you read it, really pay a lot of attention to each word and the meaning of the words that you find in the root verses, and bring the meaning to mind.
Tade nangni kasanganzu tangbo shi ani 다시기 타니당 달베거니 엔테니 순주도 똑바디 신고 주며 바레스니 쉬바레.
And last time we were talking about the ground, talking about the basis, the ground in the first line, and we said that we should not be confused. We should exactly know the ground in terms of the freedom of the two extremes and the unity of the two truths.
Tene ta Shin Nangdong Sunju Sadi Nanzu Lodi Tachikdu Nizingi Kangla Legachiki Yoba Indu Tene Nangdong Sunju Kom Sadi Kalekaboyore Lelaboyo Mare Yin Yang Tene 다 samlutan yore tende penna ni kasa milam tinjula peshu bare tadena ni kasa ke chisho chidi ani nganzu nawa tongbala tenla pa selab yongde tini nyamlenje yongdu nawa dang ni shemba se di ta yewa tawo chi cheni tini shemba di tini 제 가에당 대 아니 도에긴 탑라 삼무땅도 바이나 야 제 남동 순주 나와 마가신도 검주 여바지단 삼무땅 여바지 연구 여바인도 도르드나 나와다 셴바니부디 여와 치는 겁나 답되고 요래스는다 딩에 가상 조직 디슈바이
Now, when we talk about this unity of the two truths, or the unity of appearance and emptiness, then that is something that we struggle with initially to cultivate, because our mind actually functions within the framework of the extremes and the dualistic grasping. And so initially this is not easy. But we can develop a way of contemplating, of thinking about this unity of the appearance and emptiness in some ways that we have been looking at. For example, I have shared with you the example of the dream and how that can help us to see that appearances are actually empty. And that we can, in that way we can practice, right, by ascertaining that appearances are actually emptiness. And in order to clarify that a little bit more, we have been saying that it is important to distinguish between emptiness and our grasping or attachment to those appearances. And so it's actually our grasping, our mind that gets attached to the existence of those appearances that needs to be stopped, that needs to be dealt with or reversed, or that needs to be eliminated. And so what I emphasized on last time was that that is exactly what we need to cultivate when we think about just appearances and the empty nature of appearances. Then it is important to distinguish precisely between appearance and how we are attached to those appearances.
다 지금 나랑 게 전화라고 제바이나 단단한 주 가스바베기 셴바세 저러와 디테일즈 타 태가디 따다 규례들 가고 예사래 드니 이는 단다 가스바베기 드니 지당 셴바세 데 차발래 이는 가스바바디다 그 남도 차와 차바스디 또스 남도 라바다 버려도와 드니 페이지 당한주 인지라 즉 subtle judgment 용거봐 데라 데다우지라 고나티 스탑디아 민도 딩도 아동한주 양치당 지 사규 통교 다우지 돈인 더샤락바지게 용거여봐 데레 강시라 타바지라 순거여래 대값수 셴바세디.
So the term that is often used for this subtle grasping or attachment to appearances, that is actually a little bit problematic in translation. It's rather a form of subtle judgment, and while the Tibetan term is the term that is also used for attachment, it is here we need to understand it more in the context of a subtle judgment of appearances, rather than the coarse manifestation of the afflictive emotion of attachment, like when we, for example, are attached to or we desire something to eat or something to drink, those kind of things, right? That's a coarse manifestation of attachment and desire. Here it's really a more subtle judgment that is meant that we have with regard to the appearance.
Tadi korte chedang umegi shungde junala shikeje shidu teni sungju kola geba sungre teni chajingi ngazu shichage chimbo sini ti junala teni tinju kola mabo sungre tinju signa ani ina lawar do ngazu da kunkin longjen rabjam ki semni ngaso liu chupa ki kapsula tini shito be sherap thani la mine pas ne de kapsula tini sem liu chupa nang la wala shito be sherap thani la mine pas ki liu chure ta de nang la tini nawa tang sem ni buti ani nang la rashi matuba yimba yinsu di shiraki 아니 개벽권의 수요래다 된소 식도 바이네야 소소라 도파 대충 된소 세라 핑계도 딩도 심닝 알소 롱진 랍점기 알소 거스면서 여러와 되나니
So when we consider this basis, the ground that describes the unity of the true truth, then of course we find that described and explained in a lot of detail in the Madhyamaka texts, and it is also mentioned in the Mahamudra texts that it's extremely important to ascertain the ground in that way. And Longjang Rabjam also in his text what was it in English? Anyways, in the
resting in the natural state of mind.
Yeah, resting in the natural state of mind. Thank you, Khenpo. We find in the chapter on the primordial wisdom, realizing the ground, very detailed explanations of the nature of the mind and those descriptions, the realization of that unity. And I would like to encourage you to read more in detail about this in those different places where you can find those explanations.
Laso, that deni, that dringi anima, nipa, lam, soni, sunju, se dini malatni, shugins.
And today I would like to continue with the next part, with the path, which is concerned with the two accumulations.
Tachidang shi dini dang lam choni sunju se di shira ki dewa chimbo jure penangara su tawa dang gombala ni khazan thyo mong bu sain ba dewa chimbo yobana shin 시디 야보 마도나 랑싱기 람디레 지 존이 숭죽세 도아디 카요레 노사 인가체요레 시디니 숭주 임바들라 니셰 야보 계송바이나 데이 슈기 람촌이 숭주세들라 노사디 뇽와다 아니 촌이 숭주데 랑싱기 레병에서도 보지 고 차교레 다 시디 사분다 보지 네 가장 별의슈마 람디 행동다버지 제부디다 제부다고 봐. 사변 야보여나 행동대 랑신게 야보용 거래. 사변 거란데서 야보면은 행동대 야보용도 봐. 디지털다 람촌이 순죽세디 야보용다 미용디 ngaransu tawala shidingi sungju ki tawadi yemela 개발 첨부 중도 그랬으니까 당보 실험 얘기는 대화디 안 되는 시작도 와.
Generally, the ground, so here is extremely important. The ground describes the two truths, right? When we talk about the ground and subsequently the path, then this is according to the presentation of view and meditation. And I already mentioned previously that the view is essential, the ground of the view is essential in order to practice the path that is the two accumulations. If the view is not properly understood, if the ground is not properly understood, then there's a lot of room for mistakes when practicing on the path and practicing the twofold accumulations. While if we have a very solid understanding, a very solid foundation of the view, then there will be less mistakes. There's less chance for mistakes in our practice of the path, of the two accumulations. And actually, it will kind of come naturally to gather the two accumulations. I have previously already mentioned this by means of an example. I told you the example of the ground being like the seeds. So the view is like the seeds, and the path is the growing, the growing of the seeds, and then eventually we can have the fruit. That's the result, right? The fruit is the result of the harvest. And when the seeds are good, then they can grow and we can have the fruit in the end. So the view is really the most important. The view of the two truths is really essential also for the practice of the twofold accumulation, which are the path.
다디드니 자비식 도kur tatal 총이 람족기 있으니 디디인 거래. 다디기 된다조 가르템 바레스나더니 골축 메베기 람디 가르레스나 골사기 람 도도당 꿀팁니 요래 엔 데니당 달베기 총이 숭도 주바디 아니 마노로바 마툴베기 양다베기 람디레스니 숭바레.
So the line that is then concerned with the path, the twofold accumulation, reads the supreme path, twofold accumulation, unlimited by projection and denial. And so what is to be mistakenly understood and what needs to be traversed is the path, the supreme path of the twofold accumulations. And what would be mistaken, what would be limiting is, or what keeps us from traversing that path, that are the projections and denial, the superimpositions and denigrations. And so freedom from those, freedom from projection and denial, that is the supreme path.
다 가상 시 값을 더버지니 단다 람제 값을 다양 측강대 나랑 아주 선보 땅사디 니 더시도 내가디 당보디 카르레스나 도쿠르 세드레 딜라 삼로지 둔다지 선보 당국어레 디니 니바디 디니 초니 세드 초니 세드 다 둔다 도도 니 더시대 봐.
Just like we have seen it already in the previous line, where there were two things we could consider in the line, here too we see two different aspects that we have to understand. first we have the projections and denial. That's one topic here to look at and to consider. And then the second thing to consider is then the twofold accumulations.
Tene da dogur se tegi norsa ditembare lam kapsula norsa ni yores ta ni yores ta chigdi dota padre ta shimbati kruvate padre sumbare.
So the projection and denial, as it says in the text, the unlimited by projection and denial, they are the two ways we can go wrong, the two mistakes we can make on the path. So when we're practicing on the path, there can be two issues that we might encounter. Those are the two extremes of superimposition or projection, or denial or denigration.
Tene da di pangjar wa ta ni di pangjare tene langjaji da di nyembo yores di inkares na tene cho ni budre sumbare da cho ni di sedu sunam ge cho dan yishe ge chos.
So those two are to be abandoned, to be rejected or avoided. And the second aspect that we see here is then actually the antidote against those. How do we avoid those? Through what is to be taken up, what is to be practiced, and that are the two accumulations. The two accumulations, or the twofold accumulation, refers to the accumulation of merit and the accumulation of wisdom.
Totodang kurtebse di manzu namba sanje pa ki taduki kapsula tini tumong mayimbi ki ta karso tanyin jigre ta diri ki gyur yongdu tizu kago yosare da tanda ke gyurba nashi re yang kashe ki exaggeration and denigration in segidu damina yungudu ba ta di kangtar da tunda di jidang kage dawale beju tangbayena pena midi yako yobala yang tini susuji magawala soba gyumsin de jeni tini yabo mindus lab shakbayena katangbayena tinjula kurwa deba sigore yang ji midi ji yabo mena yang da ji ngarang pinja yimbe sodawa dang susu kasa yimbe sodawa dang kanta Tendeji jeni da midi la yunde mangpo yore damira la shakbayena de la droto ba sigore kage le beju tangbayena tsikdi rwa teni ina yang tanda kapsubabe da chöke dang tawa dang densu kapsula bejo dang yungdu da go deba jena tulbe wangi ngöbe nesul ki tengdu la yoba la mepam yimba la maimba sini jin songbe ki lo namdo de la tul songba de la marik ba de la karisi goresna kurwa deba sigore yang lo di tul ne ani yul ngobe nilu ki tengdola yoba chigla mebaredo samme jimbata wada maimbala ji himbaredo samme jinsongwaina dela dotoba sigore.
Again, what is translated here as projection and denial, or in other translations as superimposition and denigration, or exaggeration and denigration. There are many different terms that are being used for the translation, but it probably is important here again to look at what is actually meant. Since we have all these different translations, it's not as straightforward. Generally, we can consider that in a mundane context, an exaggeration is to, for example, say that someone who's actually good has qualities. That a denigration, sorry. So generally, when we, for example, have a person who actually has qualities, is a good person, but we for some reason don't like that person, and then we say, oh, that person is not good, that person is really bad. That's a denigration. That's a denial of the qualities, and or however we want to translate that. When the person is actually not good, doesn't have inequalities, but they're somehow part of our family, or they're a relative, or we like them for some other reason, and we then say, oh, this person is really good, this person is really, really accomplished or good, then that would be a superimposition of qualities that are not there. So that would be a projection. So in a general mundane context, that's how we can superimpose or exaggerate people's qualities, or fall into denial or denigrating them. In a Dharma context, nevertheless, when we use superimposition and denigration in a Dharma context, in Dharma language, then we can be very specifically define denigration as the denigration of an entity's nature based on confusion. So based on confusion, we while an entity would exist, we say that it doesn't exist, or that something that is a particular way is not that way, right? So denying existence where it is, and then saying that something that is a way is not that way. That would be denigration. And so that's a form of ignorance. So out of confusion, one denies the nature of a particular entity that exists to be that way. The superimposition, accordingly, is then also a state of confusion where something does not exist and we superimpose an existence. So to say that something exists that doesn't exist, or something to be a way that it is not, that is superimposition, or as also translated, exaggeration or projection.
Pena that is ngazu kotibachina pena ngazu those chose de la tayong de samlo tangsu ni yong ju go re chose de karre se chose de ranshin de ta chose de ngarang lo de matu ba yin tini chose de ngarang ki lo la nang wa tar tu ani yul ki teng tu duba di chose korangi ngore sambaina nangla nangwa tartu dubdeba de korangi tartu ge ranshin ji ngojire sambaina dota pare karesin chose nilu de tende mare da chose du tong shin du de gangla anzu dang nge logle di shana ko ge lega ji ge ro shaksa pen to ge ro tende ge lega tende ge jawadi tong shindu je shindu dini ta chokje se ji zawani yo mare sambegi dendegi namdo dabu jigda kye sha ba ina dela kurwa de ba sla pare.
Again, an example will help to understand that there are two ways we can misconceive of, for example, the table in front of me. So we might think with our confused mind that the table in front of us is actually really established as an object in the way that it appears. So that it has the essence, like that what appears is actually exist in exactly that way, that is the nature. And to think that things just like the table exist in the way that they appear, that is to superimpose such existence. That is superimposition, that is exaggeration. On the other hand, right now, the table appears in front of me, right? It even fulfills the function of being the place where I can put the laptop, it holds the laptop. And so it appears and it also fulfills a function. So to deny that, to say there is no table appearing, there is no table fulfilling the function of holding up the laptop, that is then a denigration.
다디지디 지당께지 셰바이나 안주 남도기 최대 주진 낭니 딜라 reaction 지지기로와 할람 야자 굽주다우디 차상디 니진당 천진라소베기 도도같이 차대기 그래요. 삼로야고 땅바이나
We can generally say that when we see things, then we have certain reactions to the appearing phenomena. And maybe 90% of that are the reactions based on our dualistic grasping and our grasping to characteristics. So we really have to consider that. So these are all superimpositions.
난주 지당기 셈라 도독 원도 만도나 할람직 셈기 내가 지당데 제미시버다고 차야기 때문에 전환하고 지요래.
We might even feel like that we really need to base all the workings of our mind on prior superimposition. So that's how we engage, how our mind works, only by first superimposing something.
디인디 간주 우메게 값을라 최탐제 똑배 딱점도 두바 세지 숭어래. 다 똑배 딱점도 두바 임발라 간주 된데 천안리게요 말에 율랑은 두바질랑 무슨진이 내가 지거래. 샘남도 내가 지긴 차상대.
In the Madhyamaka text, this is described as phenomena being mere, like all phenomena are being mere conceptual imputations. But we don't see it that way, and so we follow the way that our mind superimposes a nature on things. And we're not even aware of it.
다 지당 아주 인식에 나로라지 지당 배주당주지 no more no less as it is 즉 배주당 여러봐 거랑 다 도도가 세디 more 되디 세디라고 지래 아니 꾸르와데 바세디 less 세수라고 지래 아니 다 디니 또 수여 봐는 남상 그 니루리 가이두고 여러분 니루리 데두고 투두고 여러분 as it is 차지어 말봐 스스기파 로기 가래 통고고도 디 통샤거 마도 율 가래 임바도 추 통두고요 말해
in English we say the nature as it is, for example. Like that's one phrase that we use. And superimposition then refers to adding something more than there actually is, right? That is superimposition. And less than just what it is, that is denigration. So if we just add a little bit more, or we reduce it a little bit less from the state of just what it is, then we're actually in a state of confusion with regard to the actual abiding or the actual nature. And what we need to see is just what it is, right? But as long as we superimpose or denigrate, as long as we're engaging based on these two extremes of superimposition and denigration, then we don't actually see the object as it truly is. And that is based on our conceptualizations and not on how the object really projects itself on us, but how we project on it.
그래서 다딩이 도도당 쿠르테스 측디 뛰어서 개정부 인바당 되니 양지 또또서 고카고 인된 미스 세시 슈바인스.
So I've clarified this, these two terms here, the superimposition and denigration, or exaggeration and denigration, and projection and denial, these different ways of translating it, because I think these two words are actually really important, and in a way they're difficult to understand, so that's why I clarified this here in some detail.
되니 김선칙디 알아서 도도당 쿠르테니디 출배왕기 내니게 왕도 쉬어봐야나 되니 아주 착당스러워 봐 녀몽바 망보지 내니게 왕도 쉬어니 끼는 거요. 근데 인바인데 데니라 삼로타니 나랑 도도게 왕도 쉬어도 쉬어면도 쿠르테게 왕도 쉬어도 쉬어면도 쓰니 가디나 나랑서 율 제바당 율 미tuk바당 두바당 태용도 람사지 통마르티 따지 따이디 뺀내가 좀 버려. 디 따지 땅 두바이나 나선수 되샤당 시당라야 도저지 까도 그래. 컨트롤 제도 그래. 대성산디 내가 좀 버지래. 차당디 파 용로 따야다 메버스엘라. 도도당 꿀팁 왕도 마셔야 돼.
One reason why this concept is so important is that because of this confusion, we often fall under the power of these two extremes of projection and denial, or superimposition and denigration, exaggeration and denigration. And when we are under the power of exaggeration and denigration, then that constitutes the basis for the development of a lot of afflictive emotions. And so it's always good to first check when we get very attracted by something beautiful that we see, or when we experience aversion against something. It's always good to first check ourselves whether we have actually fallen under the power of these two extremes, whether we confused, we're under the power of confusion, have fallen into projection and denial, or exaggeration and denigration, or not. So when we see something beautiful and we are very attached, or when we develop desire for it, then it's good to first analyze our own minds and check whether this is just a projection, whether this is just a superimposition. And that can help us to control more severe forms of attachment, desire, or aversion, anger.
Pena azu nganazu misela samlo tangbai na da tingsang azu nganazu chasang modern consumerism ki culture ki nangla digi yore ta degi khanale ti lega khandis chigi yore sene gyacha gupchu di ta nganzo ki excitement da disappointment chasang di toto dang kurteb ni ki nane chungsha go chire do wa degi foundation do di samla yabu tangbai na sim gi lega chitang chire.
For example, if we consider our current life and how we live, we all are subjected to modern consumerism, right? We all somehow are part of this modern consumerism. And when we consider how that works, how our minds work in these modern times, then about 90% again, or 99% of the way our mind works in this is based on superimposition and denigration. So it's really the workings of our minds falling into the extremes of superimposition and denigration is the basis for this way of thinking and craving and so on.
Inayang dadi unfortunately ngarang zuge haku ge yamarte corporate din zuge haku gudwa dadi tis lopambo dawsire.
It's very sad. We don't really know that. We are not aware of this, but the companies and corporations, they are very aware of it. It's really...
Tindu susuki todo dang kurtebla toji ngwezin tu ngoshe ba na susuki mise ki nang la shida ji control taw je tu gre.
When we can recognize how our minds might be falling into superimposition or might superimpose or might denigrate, and if you recognize when that happens, this actually can be very helpful to gain some control in our own lives.
Pechashana tingsang ju ta nesala samlo tangbai na depression da anxiety din ju samlo yago tangbai na unrealistic irrelevant toto tang kurteb ni la den jungsha yun nesare do wa yago tangbai na lang che bachi.
Another example is mental diseases like depression and anxiety. Most of this actually comes from unnecessary and maybe irrelevant superpositions and denigrations. That leads to a lot of mental problems.
Laso tatini tatanda ka subabati ngansu toto tang kurteb se di da toto di tanda ka subaba khandi chile se ge rese na so di kawani yungu rese na tini karise ta khasang azu nangdong keje shera wa shi kapsula kote bujena nawa tang tongba ni yebe nang ni sungju yimba hamago teni chi tongba la karisa reta ta dordinan ta de nawa la pe shemba shukche dani nawa ki chela shemba shukche da dela deni 셴바디 슉첨버지 슈 용데 값을라더니 시랍기 차데 빵도 그래 숨 시랍기 차 빵스데 값을 때 델라 가르쳐서는 도톡 바스니 다다닝아 페이지 슈임바 아지 쪽제디다 나와나 신지 요고 그래 가르스는 이 미기 통기도 네 락베 숨기도 nga seji ni nge thona yoku kare nge samna yingu kare nga matru ba yin samsam dawji ti gyab jung ngoni tinde chowas legdo wa odela tini tor dina kare nawa la pe karsene chakwa shuk chumbaji shune tini sherab dang denzu pa chade pang ni tini ji dela tini karse gersen dotok pa ase.
So now how can we look at superimposition and denigration? Where do they come from, or how do we understand their origination? First, considering superimposition again. We have been talking about the ground previously, and we were speaking about the unity of appearance and emptiness. Now, if that unity of appearance and emptiness is not correctly understood, then we misinterpret and misjudge how things are. And so superimposition is a state where emptiness is not properly understood, and there is more grasping to the appearance. When the grasping to appearances is too strong, and this subtle judgment of appearances is strong, and as we are so attached to the appearances, as we are judging or conceptualizing these appearances strongly, then we actually letting go of the aspect of wisdom. So it's through the strength of our subtle judgment, then we lose the wisdom part, the wisdom aspect. And that comes from us being very convinced of our own experiences. For example, I can touch the table in front of me, I can see the table in front of me, I can place the laptop there, and so on. And so I think that the table, as it appears, must actually exist in that way, right? So I have quite some attachment to the table or any appearance to exist in the way that it does, because I'm attached to my own experience. And so in that process, or in that context, I'm losing the wisdom of realizing how that really is. And so I'm superimposing an existence on the appearance that is not there.
Projector that design 3D projector the new da pacho langoni ji mi yabara bo thoi da ta dinte da bo ji thong yong de capsula pacho ki sungnin de kyang ba ta deni the projector de khone samno ma dang de so da bo sire de capsula ba light de kawan yung yo ba di pesha na di chokje di nawa na shin yore khares na nge mi ki thong ki tu nge lakbe sme tu nga nge ngonsum do thong song sigirwa ine ya diwachik ding anju khati na khare kurgu maresna ona nge se ki nga di mathul wa ta manarwa yimbati kyo kare sa go kimsen kare sui tha je baresna ngaju di kyo ne kora samlo konyu yo mare di nga se sto nge thong song 인샤 로 지기도 코 만으로 맞춰 보지. 띵아주 하고 말와. 김생 가래 요슬람나. 띵아래 세 마도 지기 미시 김생입니다.
So when we take modern things like 3D projectors, for example, as an example, when nowadays it is possible that with the right projector, we actually see a person standing in a room and it looks like 3D, right? And when we see that something like that, we're completely taken aback and we're completely focusing only on the reflection, on the projection, the person appearing, a projection. We don't really think about the projector. We only think about the appearance. We don't think about where the light comes from it. We're only focusing on that appearance. And so we don't ask ourselves where these appearances come from, where this illusory 3D projection comes from, or in our normal context, where our appearances come from and how we can know that they are true. We only think that I see the table, right? So it must be true. I touch the table. I'm directly perceiving the table. And so it must be true. The appearance must be true, must be really there in that way. Now, we never question the I. We never question where this comes from. We never question who has actually found that my judgment of the object is correct, is unmistaken, right? We just take that one for granted. We take for granted that whatever I experience must be correct, must be truly in that way. So we just take it for granted that our experience of how things appear must be true without questioning the one who perceives, or the I that we think that perceives, and the role of that I.
Tordina ngaranzula Gyumsendang Rikpadang Cheba Kaya Majebetoni Nga Seti Manorwatang Matuwatang Dempatang Nutritsani Chigimeba Pe Yaboji Insha Doji Tajoshadoa Di Kandis Tajo to Grace and Samatanguazre.
In short, we just assume the correctness of the I without any reason, without any questioning, without any analysis. We just take it as a given that I am unmistaken, I am correct, I am not understanding things in an incorrect way. We just take it for granted. And so we really need to think about that, right? We really need to actually think about how we're just taking our own, the experience of the I as correct, and we're taking the I as correct without any reason for it.
Dindu nga sayadila ngansu metunda ije chuboshira ji rangji suyo debare. Di 가르치는 용바이놈 띵원에 다니는 이시스 제나 링구도 링구민도 나기 누리 제기를 제기 말해서 띵원에 제바자한테 빼내가 좀 버려.
So we actually naturally are very disposed to think that the I is right, that it's true how we experience things and so on. Just naturally comes to us to trust and believe in and agree with the I. But we should ask ourselves why we do that, and is it actually the correct thing to do? Should we be trusting the I and its judgment. Is it really trustworthy or not? Are we mistaken in such a belief in the I or not?
Pena Suzuki nga said la shira iche yo mare. Pena Hansu chunchung pugu yinbe kapsula Susu pama di pe shuk chumpuji yin Susu la kyopkenji sini pugu chunchung kangba zube kapsula riru pama ki shok lamna ko rangshin ki pama ki lakpa kala chong shakdo wa tokpa tesum kyoni me bachi kar resana nge pama re sumgi resana ko nangla ishe choyo rangshin rigi ma re samsam rochi ta dini gale chiro rewa kapsu dini lo chonga churu rewa kapsu ta nga langoni kanga tegendi pama di regidu di machi segidu ya machi segidu susu dada uchi tungudu wa ta mi kansa chikpa rang re chetan chikpa re ina soso nga se di korang gyur yongdu yul namba te chasang gyur dugo re tangbo protector thongwa de la ani jela soso la kange sogen soda uchi thongwa de na shin nga zu pe na pugu chungchung yinbe kapsu la nga se di pe na kerang kangpa di nangla chala ge chisho de gare yin di kerang kes laba ina peche da Barbie soda wada ji gasa gorbe jemo je chala di khirwa ko ge chisho ra this most important valuable things ta kerang lo nishu sumju lep zo be kapsula chala din zula ta yong be kapsula gemo shogdo wa di ge chomo kyone marwa beje me ba jere ta di kawa yugoni yuksa marane kale yungdo kapkapla manju di store room des na space me ba ta kerang gemu daw cha on ni ti ngone dane bed de ge chumbare rwa ani soso gwen dulo din zo pe mesa ge chumbare and soso kharju de ge chumba chagdo wa the most important thing in your ta di la be kapsula da important se di yul gi teng do duba member chi ta nga se khorang de ko töso ni tendel ge wang ge gyud do ge yoba jere ma do chi ko ge gare demba dirang demba yi ma jela nga zo iche mi chani mi wa tamje di context da wa da tendel da wa ji re do wa
We really can't trust this I much. We shouldn't be trusting it so much. Because we can actually see that our perceptions change quite a lot. So we can see that the present judgment of the I is really not that trustworthy. For example, when we were small children, when we were little children, we thought that our parents are just so strong and they're our protector. Small children have no doubt with regard to the strength of their parents and that they will rescue them and they will catch them. They jump off a high wall, they just jump into the arms of their parents without any hesitation because they trust that if their parents are there, they'll not fall on the ground. Right? That's how strong the trust of a child in its parents is. And I really think of the parents or a parent as strong and the protector. Now, if that child then grows up with like 15, 16 years, the perception of one's parents really change quite a lot. With 15 or 16, suddenly the parents become the annoying person who just tells one not to do this, not to do that, not to do that, and just really just annoying and causing problems for one, right? So the parents are the same. What they're doing is the same, really. But our perception of our parents changes quite drastically, right? So that shows us that a present perception, present idea of how we view things is not the most trustworthy and stable thing. So what was the ultimate protector during childhood turns into the annoying problem maker, parent that just holds one back, or like that's how teenagers often perceive their parents, right? The same is the change of perception from child to adulthood. If we ask, of another example, if we ask a child what the most important, most valuable thing in their life is, like a thing, right? Then maybe it's the Barbie or some other toy, like something to play with. Like they will be like, this is my most important thing, that's the most valuable thing I have. Fast forward to when we're 20 or 30 years old, and we look back at that, we see that stuff and we just laugh about it. We're like, this is ridiculous, this is worthless, and it's useless. And we even get into trouble, like we don't even know how to dispose of that rubbish because our storage rooms are full and we don't even know where to put it anymore. That's how useless we see the toys that we thought of as so important in childhood. And so while we're laughing about the toys, then we think that what we really need in life is like certain things. We need our bed, we need our clothes, we need like these day-to-day things. In short, what you can see here is that all of these perceptions are actually subject to change. And it's based on interdependence of the object and our perception and circumstances, context, that we perceive certain things in a certain way. So it's contextual how we perceive it, and it changes all the time. It's really just what we describe with dependent interdependence or dependent origination. It does not truly stay that way, the way that we perceive it at one point. It doesn't stay that way.
The Tordina now what are to Yore Sambiki Shemba Shutugre Di Shemba Shutobaina Tini Dotapa said the Chatugre Mambo Yungre Tini Shemba Shuchugan den Surisana Ngare Sambadabuji Ni Tongwa Yimbasosa, that Tembare Samsumdo, Tendiki Ngaranzula Ranshingi Kalorda, automatic ingrain Bachata was Yungotowa. Mazu Chekelaina, dozen lingates, wa. And in Della Shirashida each your Maris. Tini Dotati, Tordinata, Dotati, Nuno Tango Guduna. Now it's Charlie Shembadi Tini, Nuno Tango race. The Mange by Batch. The Hakover Jebala, Nase, the Kolashida, easy me. Gima Gogor Mango Tanson, Yanja Gogor Tan cigarettes, somebody Dabuji. Bet Molo Jematumna, Tizuji. Maras Injicala Mason, this suspicious Sirwa, the Nichik Sambatan Kogo, the ego dilla. Taxindilla. Surrender Gyurme.
So in short, when we talk about superimposition, that means that we experience certain appearances and then we grasp to those appearances to exist in the way that they appear. So we develop this subtle judgment or subtle attachment to the existence of the appearances, and that really brings all sorts of different kinds of superimpositions with it. Now, the subtle grasping, the subtle attachment, or the subtle judgment is like the one that engages in that is this ego. Like that's based on this ego, the idea of the I, the self, and it always goes the way that we think that I have seen it, I'm the one who have perceived it, therefore it must be there, it must be truly exist in the way that I perceive it. It's automatic, it's ingrained, it's a deeply, deeply ingrained tendency that we have to believe this ego and whatever it says that there is. And what we like in we actually call this the core emergent grasping to a self, this deeply ingrained grasping to the ego. But we should, or the existence. But we should not trust it as much. We should just not trust it in so much, and that will then reduce our superimpositions, our exaggerations. So in order to reduce our exaggerations, we need to reduce our grasping, our subtle judgment of the appearances. And consider, we should not be trusting this I, this self, so much. Because actually it has been confusing us over and over again. It has been really not being very truthful to us. Like for many, many times it has been confusing us and cheating us many, many times. So it's important to develop that we are a little bit suspicious of this ego. That we don't just blindly surrender to it all the time, but we're suspicious of it and its judgment.
Pena lo ni dong apya ki ngon la Siddhartha da ngaran su ni dabu ba yinba yin yang da Siddhartha ki lam la tenni di dagzing ki wangdu mashur bare dagzing ki kokor tangi yoba de hago ni dagzing de pa ka ring ro ka dal ni gong sang ki chabare da ngaran su tini mythu ni da lo 망보지 링나 다동이한테니 그 가래 라바디 년이 용바래 안다나 델하데 바래 잠블링다 대니를 개발다는 되기도 봐.
For example, Prince Siddhartha, 2,500 something years ago, was really just like us, like very much like us. But Siddhartha started to eliminate this grasping to the self by not trusting the way that it projects what appears, and so he followed the path and eliminated that ego grasping. And we're still here. We still, for many more years, have been listening to what the ego says, what the self says. We've still been listening to it, and that's what the difference between Siddhartha and us is.
Tardordina dazingi 가서 빼 탑라 케바고 내가란들 브레인워시 제샤요래 대왕도 쇼르기요 말에
So in short, this ego grasping has really brainwashed us, has really confused us and brainwashed us very severely, and we should not follow that. And we should be aware of that.
상제라 상스네 랍게 김센데한테니 다 다진디기 고걸 단계 여바데 하고니 그 육샤바들 상스라 버와 다진당 카드에서 맞들
So, one reason why we call the Buddha Sangye in Tibetan, and why that does include the sang, the clear, which means clearing away, having cleared away, having eliminated everything that is to be eliminated. That is actually referring to the fact that the Buddha has eliminated, has cleared away all this grasping to the self, all this ego clinging.
나서 다들인 도디나 아주 람 출바디 도도당 꾸데니레 되니 도도당 꾸데브세디 닐룩 여발라 메발 짐바당 닐룩라 메발라 여발 짐바들라 시요레스 되니 다 덴데기 도도디 조고디 되니 낭와라 심바 슉체다나 되니 도다고디 연구하래 딘디다 낭와라 심바디 시라 슉좀비지고요 말에 신데디슈고요.
So to summarize what we have been talking about today, we have been looking at the supreme path and what we go wrong with on the path, the confusions that we encounter on the path, which are superimposition or exaggeration and denigration. Superimposition is referring to grasping to an existence where there's nothing, and denigration is referring to the negation or the grasping that there's nothing where there is actually something. And when we look at superimposition, that is actually comes from our judgment or holding on to, like our subtle judgment with regard to appearances, our grasping to appearances, that is very strong. And so once we judge the existence of appearances, that things exist in the way that they appear, in a subtle way, then on top of that we develop all these superimpositions. And so it's again this attachment, this grasping, this subtle judgment that we should avoid in order to avoid these superimpositions or projections or exaggerations.
드닌다 대다기 도다기 짜와다고 찍기더니 짜와짜와다 당진래 드니 nganzu namjir dalsin la surrender jesha yore samdachani matani tijigyo mare teni dalsin gi tha jesha pata dalsin gi lapsha ba khala shira nyingyo mare ichi chigyo mare tike chumbres.
The very root of this grasping and the superimpositions is actually the grasping to the self and the ego clinging, we call it, right? The ego clinging. And usually what we do is that we just unquestionably surrender. We don't question it at all, we just surrender to whatever this ego is saying. And we shouldn't do that. We should avoid that. We shouldn't just blindly trust whatever the ego, tells us, but be more suspicious of it and question it.
Enough is enough.
In short, we have to tell the ego enough is enough.
Chancho semcho rinpoche, mage banam ge gyurenche, geba nyambara meba yang, gone gondo pelbare sho.